All right, Nancy Talbot, it's excellent to have you with us. We're really glad to have you here. We have been covering the crop circle phenomena as such in some of our previous radio programs, so our listeners will obviously be aware of the phenomena. We've also touched about some of the scientific details that have been coming up here as well, and most of it obviously points to the kind of work that you've been doing, Nancy, together with people like John Burke and Dr. Levengood, W.C. Levengood, obviously, and we'll talk more about this later on. But as a way of introduction, Nancy, maybe you can just tell us a little bit briefly here about the BLT research, the team, and some of the main avenues that you've been studying, Nancy.
All right. BLT, of course, stands for Burke, Levengood, and Talbot. We were the original, we got together back in the very early 90s because Levengood, who, by the way, it is not Dr. Levengood. He does not have a PhD, and in the United States, you do not refer to people as doctor unless they have an MD or a PhD.
Well, there you go.
So correctly, he is simply Mr. Levengood. He is a biophysicist. He has 2 master's degrees in biophysics.
And,
but people make this...
I thought it was associated with the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Is that correct or not?
No, MIT and I did an experiment together, or we tried to, for the Discovery Channel some years ago, which was a total farce. God. But no, Levengood went to on the BLT research page on our website, if you go to the professional consultants page, you will see there clearly listed most of the consultants, not all of them actually, but most of the ones we're using, and you will see that Levengood has an MS in biophysics from the University of Michigan and an MA in bioscience from Ball State University. These are, he has been in the Midwest in Michigan always, and he worked, after he graduated, he worked at one of the research institutes at the University of Michigan. And then the bulk of his professional scientific life was in the business arena, and had nothing to do for many years with any particular university.
All right, there we go. Well, it's good to clear that up. That was actually one of the questions that have been coming in through our website from one of our listeners as well. I guess I've also seen it online, so I guess it's easy to kind of make that misconception, but I'm glad you cleared that up for us, Nancy.
People in the crop circle, as you probably have seen, many people who are interested in the crop circle phenomenon are, well, how do you say this? They're interested in, from a metaphysical, let's say, point of view.
Right.
Most of them are not highly educated and certainly not in the sciences. And their interest has been more in simply accepting the phenomenon without any judgment about whether a particular formation is a real formation or whether it's man-made, because there are quite a few that are man-made nowadays. But their interest seems to be in interpretation, which I frankly have never been able to understand. If you don't know whether the formation is genuine, then you're wasting an awful lot of time trying to interpret something that may have been made by your fellow man, and therefore would have no more meaning than whatever your fellow man was thinking when he or she created the circle. But there are many people who have taken that approach, or also many people look at the geometries because they seem to feel that if there are what they call perfect geometries encoded in the formations, that is a sign that they are genuine. Now, no work has ever been done to prove that. It's an interesting idea, but as you probably know, carrying out serious science is very expensive. It takes a lot of money, and no one yet has had the money to do an organized examination of, let's say, 10 or 15 formations, looking at them from all the different vantage points. That would be a huge help if we could do that, but nobody's had the money to be able to do that.
But you've obviously done, parts of this in one ways or another. You've been looking at different types of phenomena that are occurring around the circles, and maybe we can just talk about
Well,
that.
you know, what we have done primarily, what we got together to do
Mm,
was to look at the physical evidence. This is basically what science is equipped to do, you know, to look at physical manifestations. And so, since crop circles sit there in the field, they don't go anywhere, and they stay until the farmer decides to harvest. What you are given are hundreds, thousands of plants, and the soils, which can be examined from a number of different points of view.
mm,
Because Levengood's background was in biology and in biophysics, his primary interest was the plants. And since he was the only scientist at the time who had expressed any willingness to work on this subject, you know, most scientists they're worried about the ridicule factor. Whenever you look at something unusual, it's much harder than looking at something that many other scientists are also working on.
right.
And Levengood was, in the beginning, the only bona fide scientist available, and his interest, of course, was basically the plants. And so we began looking at crop circle plants by sampling plants from inside the formations and then taking controls at various distances outside the formation in the same field, but outside. And what we were looking for were differences in the plants, which could be perhaps some kind of an indicator of what sort of energy had been involved in flattening them in the first place, you see.
Right.
In the early days, we didn't know what to look for. We looked at all sorts of things, and slowly, over many, many years and hundreds of formations, started to realize that we were seeing a few visible plant changes, as well as a number of things related to their growth habit. This would be the germination studies that we also carried out. And we were finding very similar changes in crop circle plants from various countries, not just from England. We worked on plants from Australian crop circles, in Israel, from Holland, from Germany, from Canada, from the United States, you know, many different countries. Mm. And we discovered in time that certain parameters which we believe are indicators of the genuine phenomenon. Several of these are related to exposure of the plants to microwave radiation or something that is acting just like microwave radiation. And these are two of the visible signs. Some of the things that the changes are not visible. But in this case, there are two clearly visible signs that we think are related to an intense and very brief burst of microwaves, which is heating up the moisture inside the plant stems. What happens is that at the top of the plant stem, you have the youngest part of the plant, and it is the most elastic. Farther down the plant stem, of course, it's quite rigid. The fibers are very tough. This is how the plant stands up, of course. Mm. And what we found is that when this internal moisture is very briefly but intensely heated up, it, of course, turns to steam. And steam then, of course, expands. And at the top of the plant, where the fibers are more elastic, the steam simply stretches that top node and seeps out, and when it's gone, it leaves an elongated top or apical node. Mm. Farther down the plant stem, where the fibers are very tough and rigid, when the moisture at the nodes in those lower parts of the plant turn to steam, they cannot stretch the fibers to escape. They're simply too tough. And so what happens is the steam builds up, and then boom, it blows a hole at the node, just as it would if you took a potato or an egg or something and put it in your microwave oven and turned it on and cranked it, you know?
Right.
So, you know, those two visible signs, plant changes, are regularly found in genuine crop circles. We know that the expulsion cavities do not always occur in genuine crop circles, And this has to do partly with the amount of moisture inside the plant stem, which obviously changes as the plant ages. In the early stages of growth, there's quite a bit of moisture inside the plant stem. Farther on, as you get closer to harvest, there's less and less and less because, the farmers harvest, I think, when it's around a 10% percentage of moisture in the stems. And by then, they are brown and very little moisture. And so often in mature plants, if a crop circle occurs, late in the season, you will not see the expulsion cavities.
That's interesting. And so obviously there must be something else then, other clues that you mentioned to you that indicates that a circle or a pattern is genuine. And what are some of those aspects?
Well, there are many. First, as I say, is this apical node elongation. That is the best studied. We've done more work on that than anything else. The second is this business of the expulsion cavities. There is a third visible sign, which can only be judged if you know when the formation occurred and how soon after that you are there to observe it. This is the node bending. Not bending at the base of the plant. I'm talking about bending at the nodes. It can be a very strong indicator that the plants were exposed to these energies. And if, in fact, that is the case, you will see this node bending immediately. Not in time, but immediately, as soon as the formation has occurred. Now, this can be a real problem. In England, it's not so much of a problem because you have people out looking every day for brand new circles, And they can pretty much pinpoint when most of the circles in England actually occurred because they have people up in planes flying over these areas all the time.
Right.
And so in England, you know that a formation occurred last night because it wasn't there the day before. And if you get to that formation and you see either the apical node elongation or the expulsion cavities or these very distinct bends at the nodes in the plants, that is another very good sign because you cannot bend a wheat. If you took a stalk of wheat in your own hands and tried to bend it at the nodes, you will see it won't bend. It will break above the node or below the node. What we think is going on when these things are present immediately is that the microwaves have again heated up the moisture inside the plant stem, and then whatever the agency is that is actually swirling the plants, there's some force there that all we have ever been able to say is angular momentum, which really means nothing more than we don't know what the force is. But there is a force then present, which is, of course, swirling these plants around. And that's what causes the node bending in the genuine formations. The plants, when they are flattened, particularly when they're young, you can flatten the plant any way you want to, with your feet, with a stomping board, with a roller, whatever. And if the plant is not killed, if it is simply knocked over, and particularly if it is young and vigorously growing, it will begin to reorient itself to gravity and to sunlight, and will cause bending at the nodes. It takes a couple of days for this process to start. The older the plant is when the formation occurs, the longer it takes the plant to produce this bending back up to sunlight. And in very old crop, it can't do it at all. There just isn't enough energy left in the plants. So again, node bending found in a formation that occurred, let's say, in early August, where in the northern hemisphere it's getting ready to be harvested, Bending in that case would be significant because the plant itself does not have the energy required to begin to raise itself back up toward the sun. So those are some of the visible signs. Now, what we always did, in addition to looking at those things, we would look at the nodal structure under the microscope and consistently found this stretching that would be present Yeah, and this is immediately after the formation occurred. We're not talking weeks or months later. The cells would be changed, would be elongated and stretched for exactly the same reason as microwave heating. There is another visible sign that many people in England and elsewhere pay attention to, even though it has not been scientifically evaluated, and that is bending at the base of the plant where it comes out of the dirt.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in a crop like canola, which has a very thick stalk, and the stalk is actually fairly brittle, if you try to flatten a stalk like that, it will break at the base, as will very dry wheat or oats or barley or anything else. So when you see node bending in something like canola, that's a pretty good sign, even though there's no science to back that up. Just common sense can show you that. When you see it, however, in, let's say, young barley, that is not necessarily a good indicator, because young barley and young wheat also will bend at the base if you're flattening the circle when it's very young and vigorous, quite green and vigorously growing. You can bend those plants over and they won't break at all. So you have to know a little bit about the age of the plant at the time the crop circle occurred. You have to know how much time has elapsed since it occurred and when you are there observing these things.
So there's a lot of different, obviously, variables here that one need to look out for in terms of determining one as being genuine, so to speak, then, or not human-made, however you want to look at that. But is there a simple trick then in that sense to you, Nancy, to find a non-genuine circle or a human-made circle beyond the fact that, okay, you might be looking at a stem that is broken if it's canola or what have you, but beyond that, is there anything else to you that defines a circle?
Lack of elongated apical nodes, lack of expulsion cavities, lack of nodal bending. These are all signs, that it is not made by these energies. There's another thing that people can look for that's visible, but this would not be present until sometime after the formation occurred, and that is the development of the seed heads. If a crop circle occurs in fairly immature plants, and you then go and visit that circle, let's say 3 to 4 weeks afterward, you know the date it occurred, but you're going into it 3 or 4 weeks later. What you are quite likely to see in a genuine formation is that the seed heads of the plants inside the formation, the flattened ones, have not developed as the control seed heads. They will be much smaller. Often there are no seeds present at all. Again, Levengood's feeling was that this was due to the exposure, the harmful exposure to the microwave radiation. It interfered with the plant's ability to develop the seed. And so essentially, actually, those plants are sterile. And this is what we found repeatedly when circles occurred in young crop. Before the seed was fully formed, they actually were basically sterilized because they could not reproduce themselves. The seed didn't develop well enough to produce viable plants when you planted the seeds. Now, very, very curiously, and much more interesting to us, because we know that microwave radiation is not the only energy involved.
Right.
There are other things, and one of them that we were able to prove, thank God, eventually, were these very unusual electrical pulses, which Levengood and Burke were able to replicate in the laboratory and, in fact, build a machine that could produce this effect. But the way we discovered it was that in crop circles, which occur late in the season, this would be when the seed is mature, although those seeds would be dehydrated and they would weigh less, I mean, you get a bunch of them and you weigh them, compare them to the controls, you would find that they weighed much less than the controls. The endosperm, it's an area on the seed, would be all wrinkled also. These seeds would look as if they would not germinate. And yet what we found consistently and what other scientists, a woman in Italy in particular with whom I'm in touch, and a few others, what we found was that when you planted those seeds these are from crop circles late in the season, the plants not only grew, they grew at up to 5 times the rate of normal, and they produced greater yield, and they did it with no water and no sunlight for considerable periods of time. Now, what in the world could produce this? Leavengood spent a great deal of time working on that problem and eventually realized that there were these very specific electrical pulses, which he calls ion avalanches. People who are interested in this should go to our plant abnormalities page and scroll down to item number 7, because there we discuss exactly what was found. The equipment that was built was called an MIR process. Leavengood and Burke did in fact copyright and trademark this process, which they called the stress guard process. And the machine simply delivers very strong and precise electrical pulses to seeds, normal seeds. And after much fooling around with this, it was discovered that a certain type of pulse delivered, let's say, to maize would work, that a slightly different kind of pulse had to be administered or for a different period of time to perhaps carrots or wheat or cotton or whatever. In other words, there were varying degrees of this exposure to the electrical pulse, which would cause exactly the same thing in normal seeds. We found that normal seeds so exposed would grow at up to 5 times the rate of normal. They would produce greater yield, and they would do it tolerating what are called plant stressors, meaning essentially lack of water or lack of sunlight. This particular invention is extremely straightforward. Burke spent many years toward the end of his life trying to sell this technology to the major seed companies around the world, because it does not affect the environment. It doesn't hurt any of the flora or the fauna, the bugs, the bees, etc.
Okay.
It doesn't do anything to the land. It simply produces a much more vigorously growing plant that produces greater yield. And since it will do it under stressed conditions, it was quite clear that if seed was treated with this process, and I have a link on the website to the Stress Guard website, which was up and running until John's death. It's now in an archive, but I put the link there so people can go to it, and they can see that many other universities, many other individuals did test this work. We would treat the seed and send it out to other people to plant, so that they could see what they got, and consistently, somewhere between a 35 and in some cases almost an 80% increase in yield was obtained, and yet with no harm whatsoever, no genetic abnormalities, no changing of the genome at all, no poisons, no pesticides. It didn't even need fertilizer. And what John eventually figured out after traveling all over the world to every major seed company that there is, was that the major reason why they were not interested in this technology, which is really quite simple, was because they have invested huge sums of money in genetic modification of plants.
Right.
Because they make a great deal of their money selling the pesticides that are required to grow their genetically modified plants, and they make the rest of their money by selling the fertilizers that are required. Obviously, if they used this system instead, they would not sell any pesticides to speak of, nor would they have to sell any fertilizers.
Yeah.
And so it appears to be a purely economic response. every single one of the trials that were carried out by people all over the world and various universities, every single one of them produced at least a 30 to 35% increase in yield with absolutely no effect on the environment, etc. And yet, none of the seed companies would get involved.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, these companies, obviously Monsanto, Syngenta, and the whole, global crop diversity trust, they're moving obviously in the opposite direction with the Terminator seed technology and all that too. They want people to buy seeds every season as well.
Exactly.
Over and over again. And this is the total opposite, so we can understand in that sense why they definitely wouldn't be interested in that. But what about this technology? Could that be, is it available? Is it economically available for smaller, let's say, individual farmers out there that might be interested in this? Or how developed is this the stress guard technique, if I can call it?
Now, I wish I knew more.
Yeah.
I was not involved in the this manufacturing and marketing thing. I personally, it was my opinion that since we had discovered this, the discovery was made because of our work on the crop circles. It was the crop circles that gave us this basic information. And so I felt that it was improper to try to make money from it. I thought, personally, that it should be offered free to the world, because the building of the machinery is very simple. In fact, there is a patent which has now expired. I include the patent number on the website. This is in the plant abnormalities section, item number 7. Anybody can look up the patent, and anybody can build the machine now if they wish. There's a time period, for which you can't, but that's elapsed. And anyone could do this themselves, individual farmers. And people have been calling me about this. I know that, John, I don't know how many of these machines were originally built, because I was not directly involved in any of this. I didn't approve of it, and I simply was not involved.
Sure.
But I know that John had a couple of these machines at his Long Island home, which is where he did all this work, that he would treat the seeds and then mail them out to all these different places. And I've spoken with his sister since John's death about this, and asked her if those machines, if there were any of them left, if they were somewhere, and if I could find one and get it shipped up here, then I could make it available to anybody who wanted it. I'd simply mail it to them and let them do it.
Right.
Now, she has not been able, she thinks that they were dismantled, or either that, or they may have belonged to one of John's partners who may have them, but she has not been able to find machines. However, the patent does exist. It is registered. I have I've given the patent number right on the website. Anyone interested can look it up, and would then be able to probably build one of these things themselves. And my suggestion would be for them to do that, to pay attention to this, because in fact the result was consistent. It's slightly different. It might take some fussing around to figure out exactly how much of a pulse and for how long, for whatever crop it is that you're interested in raising. But on this website, in the archives, which are listed here, where the Stress Guard archive is, there's a link right to that. The company was called Proceed Tech. And if you read through the website, you will see the differences, the increased growth rates that were documented in a whole variety of plants. And if those plants happen to be some of the ones you're growing, you might want to seriously look at this.
That's very interesting. And again, just to reemphasize this for our listeners that might not know, obviously, we're talking about John Burke here, who passed away in February 2010, and he was the co-author as well, together with Kai Hallberg, to a book called Seeds of Knowledge, Stones of Plenty. And obviously, Nancy, he did a lot of the work here in terms of determining the level of fertility technology, basically, with the connection to some of these ancient megalithic sites, and also pointing to an early, if I can call it, like evidence for the fact that these people probably were doing some kind of fertilization technique, and this was before, obviously, what we know about humanity, how we've discovered crop rotation and fertilization process that we use today, obviously.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting.
It was from, again, the crop circle work. I mean, once we found this result, I mean, we were amazed, believe me, when we first discovered this increased growth rate. We all knew simultaneously that this was something important. And when Levengood and John together, I don't know exactly which one of them did how much of what, but together they figured out this business of exposing seeds to ion avalanches, and realized immediately what this could mean, let's say, in countries where they regularly suffered drought.
Right.
Well, if they could use seed that could tolerate that, then, of course, they could grow crop and feed themselves in situations where right now they can't. I mean, he saw this and got very interested then in trying to develop all of this. And he was also, as you know, interested in ancient archaeology. And when I remember one of the first times he came with me to England back in maybe 93, John was very interested, and had been all of his life, in electricity and electrical phenomena, you know. And he was convinced that many of these ancient monuments were located at naturally occurring geomagnetic abnormalities in the Earth's crust. And he was curious as to why such places would be marked. Well, one of the things that we learned was that people, some 4% of the general population, is born with something called temporal lobe instability. In some cases, temporal lobe instability is a precursor for epilepsy, is what it is.
Right, yeah.
However, in most people who have this ability, it simply is a greater sensitivity to geomagnetic abnormalities. They can sense them where normal people cannot. John started to go to various stone Indian mounds here in North America. Then, of course, he went down to South America and Central America. That year in England, we spent a great deal of time running up and down Silbury Hill with ground electrodes and magnetometers, and then going to the stones and seeing if we could find magnetic anomalies where the stones, the megalithic stones, were placed. And slowly he became aware that in all of these situations that he tested, or almost all, including sacred spots out in the Midwest where the American Indians would hold their vision quests and things, you know. At all of these locations, he found very specific magnetic anomalies, which had then been marked by erecting megalithic stones or dolmen or pyramidal, shaped structures, or sometimes these corbel roofed structures, as here in North America. And he further discovered that these structures emphasized or accentuated the anomaly, the geomagnetic anomaly.
Right.
Now, we have to picture this. Okay, so we know that these geomagnetic anomalies exist all over the Earth's crust in various places. We now know that building certain types of structures over them increases the intensity of, the effect. And John, I guess partly because of his association with Levengood, decided to take seeds, indigenous seeds, in each area and place them inside these structures or near this geomagnetic anomaly. And again, with a great deal of trial and error, eventually it was discovered that at certain times of the year and for certain periods of time, if you place seeds in these places, they also would grow much more rapidly, produce greater yield, and do it without as much water or sunlight as is normally required. That led John to the belief that ancient people had somehow or other discovered this fact. And then we knew that, okay, some 4% of the population generally has this temporal lobe instability. We know that most of those people never develop epilepsy, but that they can recognize these places where there are geomagnetic abnormalities naturally occurring.
Mm.
Furthermore, in these places, particularly when there's a dome shape or pyramidal shaped structure, stone structure, built over them, there are sometimes completely spontaneous light displays, bursts of light, which the people who are temporal lobe unstable can easily see. Because they can sense when it's happening, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And so John and I, we thought about this maybe eons ago. There were various tribes of people, let's say in England, just for whatever, and winters, could be very rough if you didn't have enough food that you'd been able to raise or store in the summer. Once these cultures were agricultural, you could have serious troubles. And we pictured that perhaps there was someone in a given tribe who had this abnormality, this temporal lobe instability, and had recognized this a place in their general area that did have this naturally occurring, abnormality. That these places were then, because sometimes there would be light displays there, that these places were then thought of as, in a spiritual way.
They become sacred sites or sacred places.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that then the various cultures would mark these spots either with the dolmen or the megalithic stones or whatever.
Mm.
And so then we imagine, okay, we've gone on a few years, the place is marked, and the temporal lobe unstable individual in the tribe has become the shaman of the tribe, the spiritual leader. And the spiritual leader now lives in a structure which has been created over this particular anomaly.
Yeah.
Well, the shaman has a brother. And one day the brother is going out into the fields to plant, and he has a sack of corn slung over his arm, which he's going to go and plant. And before he goes and plants, he decides to visit his brother, the shaman, to say hi. And he does so, and perhaps they have a conversation of 15 or 20 minutes. Well, it's entirely possible that the seed, which was with the brother who came to say hi, was then exposed, you see, to these energies. Then therefore, when those seeds were planted, it would not take too long for people to start to realize that if you went to see the shaman before you planted your seed, you might get this much more vigorous crop with greater yield. Mm. If such a thing were discovered, it would then become the custom to mark these spaces, because they were very important, to go to these places for certain periods of time before planting in order to ask the gods, to improve your crop yield. And that was basically what John thinks, or did think, was the reason for these monuments that were erected all over the world.
I heard John mention also in an interview that, understandably, it takes a lot of effort, energy, and manpower to build these, but in some cases they were decided upon in the tribe or the civilization, the people that we're talking about, to be built when the situations were kind of dire as well, when you think that they would have put more time into maybe going out hunting or finding food in some other way, but in some cases they had to do this, or they decided to do this when things weren't that great as well, which means that obviously in those cases the people who were designing them knew what they were doing. They probably might have talked with other people, other tribes from other areas, who have given them the clue even that what you need to do if you have any trouble in terms of seeds and production of food and things like that, is to construct these megalithic sites, obviously again over at the right area, at the right spot, in order to increase your yield, and the following year or the next, this will begin to kind of pay off, if I can put it that way, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's an hypothesis, of course.
Sure.
I mean, we don't know that this is the final truth, but it is a very rational way to look at what could have happened. I mean, a huge number of man-hours went into the building of many, many of these structures. And when you think about that, why would people do this? I mean, some of them, there's some things people might do for artistic reasons or for survival reasons. I mean, protections, walls that are built to keep the enemies out, that sort of thing.
Right.
But he really was very convinced that most likely various cultures around the earth had discovered this somehow. He had no real idea how they had, but we know that this temporal lobe instability is one possible way that they could have discovered this. And once discovered, it would give whatever tribe had this secret considerably more sustenance and therefore power than any group which didn't know about this. So, I mean, maybe, I don't know whether he was right or not, but it's an interesting concept.
Yes.
And in fact, the studies that he did carry out with his co-author, his name is, you say his name, Kaj?
Kai.
Kai.
I think
I don't know him.
He's from Denmark, I think. So Kai is how we would pronounce it up here in Sweden anyway. Kai Hallberg, yes. Well,
the two of them, did take these seeds, indigenous seeds in all these different places, and they did many trials, and they found that this is exactly what happened. So perhaps these ancient cultures also knew that this would happen, and that is why they built these megalithic monuments and tombs. I mean, not tombs, the pyramids and things.
Right, exactly. It's a
very interesting idea, and he backed it up with many, many trials in which, he would take seeds to these places and then grow them out and find that he got this result consistently.
That's absolutely very interesting. And again, for people who want to read more about this, obviously pick up a copy of the book. There are Seeds of Knowledge, Stones of Plenty. I got a copy a while back here. I've been about halfway through it. It's very, very interesting, and some really fascinating stuff in there. So absolutely check that out. But how?
And if they go to the BLT website, John's book is listed on the published papers page. So if they forget, they can find it there.
Okay, excellent. That's wonderful. And how does? I mean, I can't recall now when the book came out, if it was 2004 or whatever, but how long had John Burke been working with you guys at BLT? How long have you been running that at this point, and how does this, if anything, the subject connect with the whole crop circle studies in that sense?
Well, because we've been working a number of years. I'm looking here to see if I can find out when the book was published. I don't have one in front of me.
I don't have my copy here with me either, actually. Let's see. I think it's 2000.
I can go get it, but
2004.
This week, no, I think it's later than that. 2005.
There we go. Yeah.
And we had been working for some time, on the crop circle research, and had already discovered this increased growth and yield factor. So he was well aware that it could occur. And he and Levengood had begun by then playing around with trying to replicate that effect. And on the exposure to these unusual electrical energies, he was already convinced that had something to do with it. And so once he had that basic information he saw from the crop circle work, that it clearly was happening in the crop circles. And then when they finally did get the machine, the MIR machine built, it was quite clear that they could reproduce that by exposing the seeds to these unusual electrical pulses. And he knew that because he'd been doing this magnetometer work at various sites around the world, that these anomalies, which were all over the Earth's crust anyhow, produced the same sort of electrical pulses periodically.
Yeah.
It was quite logical then to think, maybe somebody else discovered this, either by accident or however, Maybe the gods came down and told them, who knows? But if they had discovered it, and if they knew that building stone structures over these naturally occurring anomalies intensified the results, then of course that would have been an intelligent thing to do.
I know that John traveled around with a electrostatic voltmeter as well to measure some of these energies around. And did he do any of this work in terms of the crop circles as well, to bring this device with him in order to measure instabilities around the areas? And if so, do you know what he found there in many of those cases?
Yeah, the very first year that he came over with me, we had electrostatic voltmeters with us, and we spent quite a bit of time looking to see if we could find any change in the response to the equipment at the crop circle sites. And it's unfortunate in a way. There have been other people now who have taken electrostatic voltmeters to the circles, but they have failed to follow the protocol. They don't know how to use the equipment, and they report what they're doing as science, and they report all sorts of stupid things. The fact of the matter was that there were definite electrostatic charge differences in the crop circles that occur at dawn as the sun is coming up, and also occur and are clearly present at sunset when the sun is going down, is leaving. And we found, and he did this, I didn't do all of this work with him, I did some of it. But it was very clear that there were changes in the electrostatic voltage present at these specific times.
Well, how
now,
so?
These voltmeters, what?
How so? How only this particular time, sun setting and rising?
Apparently, it has to do with the effects, literally, of the sun on the plant heads. The voltmeters, the ones we were using, have an open head, and we attached, I think they were straws that we had cut so that they would extend exactly 1 inch from the head of the voltmeter, and then we taped the straws to the voltmeter so it stuck out, just 1 inch. And the idea was that you would approach the seed head and touch the seed head with the straw, which meant that you were exactly 1 inch away from the seed head, and measure the voltage. And then you would keep doing this as the sun rose. And what you found was that the electrostatic charge changed, increased as the sun rose. The people who have subsequently done electrostatic voltmeter work, instead of following any kind of protocol or having any understanding of what they were doing, they walk into a crop circle, and none of them would bother to get up in the morning or to be in the evening, at these sites. And they would just wait till the middle of the day, and they would go in and wave these electrostatic voltmeters around in the air. And of course, this doesn't mean anything, because if you move the meter, any air rushing over the head causes a change in the reading. And they have done this for several years, these people who do it, claiming that they're finding all sorts of incredible changes and claiming that those changes mean something, when all they mean is that they are misusing the instrument itself. But I'm afraid I don't know a great deal about that work that John did, and he didn't write it up, as far as I know, in any great detail, the electrostatic work. We did do also a bunch of ground electrical measurements in southern England. This was where you take an electrode and drive it into the ground in certain places, and we did this particularly up and down Silbury Hill to see if we would get differences in the ground electrical charge, because it was, I don't know, it was Levengood or Burke had thought that, probably it was John, although I'm not sure, thought that as the water table decreases in southern England is on a chalk aquifer.
Right.
And chalk, of course, is the most porous of the rocks. And as the water trickles down from summer rains down through the chalk, the aquifer itself is lowering. And so that means that the raindrops have to travel farther and farther and farther to get down to the aquifer. And apparently, as the rain passes through the chalk, electrons are stripped off, And what you get is a slight increase as the summer goes along in the ground electrical charge. Now, we know in one year, John found records in England that showed 1 year in which the aquifer was being pumped deliberately by the water people in England.
Mm-hmm.
And that year, the aquifer was the lowest it had ever been, and the number of crop circles which appeared were the greatest that had ever appeared.
Really?
The idea here was that if the theory that a plasma, an atmospheric plasma of some sort, atmospheric plasmas are known when they spiral to emit microwaves. They're also known to be associated with these unusual electrical pulses, and they're also known to be associated with strong magnetic fields. These are all the things that we found in the crop circle work, you see. Unusual electrical pulses, the presence of microwaves, and then these magnetic fields, which we discovered through the work in the soil. And so the hypothesis was that some sort of a currently unknown, as yet unnamed, atmospheric plasma discharge was involved in the crop circle creation process. When we found that the ground electrical charge changed over the summer in southern England, because we measured it repeatedly, the idea was that this change in the ground electrical charge might be functioning as an attractor to the atmospheric plasma, you see. Again, not proven, but we did enough work to show that that might be a reasonable thing to follow up on, because in every year, the numbers of crop circles increase as the summer goes along, with a great many of them towards the end of the summer, when in fact the aquifer is at its lowest naturally, whether it's being pumped or not. That particular year, there was 1 year we looked at when it was pumped, but generally, normally, it is not pumped. But it does drop as the summer goes along. And so the ground electrical charge goes up, and this then might be what is causing the circle phenomenon to occur so frequently in southern England.
That is very interesting, and I want to address this more here, Nancy, in our second hour, and talk about how some of this potential then atmospheric plasma discharge, how they can create the patterns that are put down into it. There's so much interesting things that are to be known yet about in terms of plasma, and we know that it's scalable and that it indeed has these different shapes that have been studied. Some of this work have been done by the guys from the electrical universe theory,
right?
As well. Obviously, there is another Dutch guy we had on where we talked about plasma mythology, actually, and where some of these patterns that are created by plasma actually can be look
some
very
of the
similar
patterns
here.
Are exactly the ones that we see most frequently.
That's right, exactly. But let's just talk a bit about your website here at the end of the first hour, Nancy, and if there's anything specific you'd recommend to our listeners, if there's any way for them to help you guys out to do your research or whatever else you want to mention. Obviously, bltresearch.com is the main website, and for those who are new to the material, there's tons of stuff there for you to dig into and to research in terms of the scientific aspects as well. But is there anything else, Nancy, that you want to mention to our listeners who might be new to the material, or how they can help you guys out in any way?
Well, field workers, people who are willing to do field work and capable, are always welcomed. And donations we're entirely supported by donations. There's no public money at all. It's all private donations. Most of it was our own. Then Lawrence Rockefeller did give us a grant to carry out this clay mineral XRD study.
Oh, really?
And
that's interesting.
We're going to talk about that, I think, in the next hour. And there are people who donate, but we cannot do this. What this work doesn't. It costs money to do.
Right.
Particularly when you get into some of the chemical analyses that we're doing now, and some of the soil work, the X-ray diffraction work is very expensive. And I mean, we're very limited. We can only do what we either have contributing personnel, our consultants, what they can do, or if we're trying to do a study that one of our consultants does not happen to have an expertise in, then we have to pay for it, you see.
Yep.
Plus just maintaining the website. I mean, if there is a listener out there who is highly competent at websites, I have to pay a great deal of money I can't do it myself, and it costs thousands of dollars to put up all this information and to maintain it.
Well, you need to get a better web company in that case. Absolutely, there's a lot of talented people out there I know as well that can do this stuff very simply, and it's for those who are technically inclined.
The site is not complex, and it's not that the woman is not competent. She's highly competent.
Sure.
And she does a great job.
Yeah.
It's just it costs money.
Sure. Absolutely. But there's a lot of people out there who have knowledge, and I'm sure they're willing to help out if they feel attracted to the kind of work that you're doing. So absolutely keep that in mind for those who are interested. Again, then bltresearch.com is the main website, and we have so much more, Nancy, to talk about in our next hour. The XRD, the clay mineral crystallization case studies that you've been doing, some of this new finds in terms of the white powder that have been found, kind of a magnesium carbonate here in the Dutch crop circles. Very interesting, and some of the plasma things you've discovered in the UK 2009 season. I also obviously want to ask you more about Lawrence Rockefeller and how he...
Whether a particular formation is a real formation or whether it's man-made, because there are quite a few that are man-made nowadays. But their interest seems to be in interpretation, which I frankly have never been able to understand. If you don't know whether the formation is genuine, then you're wasting an awful lot of time trying to interpret something that may have been made by your fellow man, and therefore would have no more meaning than whatever your fellow man was thinking when he or she created the circle. But there are many people who have taken that approach, or also many people look at the geometries because they seem to feel that if there are what they call perfect geometries encoded in the formations, that is a sign that they are genuine. Now, no work has ever been done to prove that. It's an interesting idea, but as you probably know, carrying out serious science is very expensive. It takes a lot of money, and no one yet has had the money to do an organized examination of, let's say, 10 or 15 formations, looking at them from all the different vantage points. That would be a huge help if we could do that, but nobody's had the money to be able to do that.
But you've obviously done, parts of this in one ways or another. You've been looking at different types of phenomena that are occurring around the circles, and maybe we can just talk about that.
God. But no, Levingood went to on the BLT research page on our website, if you go to the professional consultants page, you will see they're clearly listed most of the consultants, not all of them actually, but most of the ones we're using, and you will see that Levingood has an MS in biophysics from the University of Michigan and an MA in bioscience from Ball State University. These are, he has been in the Midwest in Michigan always, and he worked, after he graduated, he worked at one of the research institutes at the University of Michigan, and then the bulk of his professional scientific life was in the business arena, and had nothing to do for many years with any particular university.
All right, there we go. Well, it's good to clear that up. That was actually one of the questions that have been coming in through our website from one of our listeners as well. I guess I've also seen it online, so I guess it's easy to kind of make that misconception, but I'm glad you cleared that up for us, Nancy.
People in the crop circle, as you probably have seen, many people who are interested in the crop circle phenomenon are, well, how do you say this? They're interested in, from a metaphysical, let's say, point of view.
Right.
Most of them are not highly educated and certainly not in the sciences. And their interest has been more in simply accepting the phenomenon without any judgment about what some kind of an indicator of what sort of energy had been involved in flattening them in the first place, you see.
Right.
In the early days, we didn't know what to look for. We looked at all sorts of things, And slowly, over many, many years and hundreds of formations, started to realize that we were seeing a few visible plant changes as well as a number of things related to their growth habit. This would be the germination studies that we also carried out. And we were finding very similar changes in crop circle plants from various countries, not just from England. We worked on plants from Australian crop circles, in Israel, from Holland, from Germany, from Canada, from the United States, many different countries. And we discovered in time that certain parameters which we believe are indicators of the genuine phenomenon. Several of these are related to exposure of the plants to microwave radiation or something that is acting just like microwave radiation. And these are two of the visible signs. Some of the things that the changes are not visible. But in this case, there are two clearly visible signs that we think are related to an intense and very brief burst of microwaves, which is heating up the moisture inside the plant stems. What happens is that at the top of the...
All right, Nancy Talbot, it's excellent to have you with us. We're really glad to have you here. We have been covering the crop circle phenomena as such in some of our previous radio programs, so our listeners will obviously be aware of the phenomena. We've also touched about some of the scientific details that have been coming up here as well. And most of it obviously points to the kind of work that you've been doing, Nancy, together with people like John Burke and Dr. Levengood, W.C. Levengood, obviously, and we'll talk more about this later on. But as a way of introduction, Nancy, maybe you can just tell us a little bit briefly here about the BLT research, the team, and some of the main avenues that you've been studying, Nancy.
All right. BLT, of course, stands for Burke, Levengood, and Talbot. We were the original, we got together back in the very early 90s because Levengood, who, by the way, it is not Dr. Levengood. He does not have a PhD, and in the United States, you do not refer to people as doctor unless they have an MD or a PhD.
Well, there you go.
So correctly, he is simply Mr. Levengood. He is a biophysicist. He has 2 master's degrees in biophysics.
And
but people make this...
I thought it was associated with the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Is that correct or not?
No. MIT and I did an experiment together, or we tried to, for the Discovery Channel some years ago, which was a total farce. What we have done primarily, what we got together to do was to look at the physical evidence. This is basically what science is equipped to do, to look at physical manifestations. And so, since crop circles sit there in the field, they don't go anywhere, and they stay until the farmer decides to harvest. What you are given are hundreds, thousands of plants, and the soils, which can be examined from a number of different points of view. Because Levengood's background was in biology and in biophysics, his primary interest was the plants. And since he was the only scientist at the time who had expressed any willingness to work on this subject, most scientists they're worried about the ridicule factor. Whenever you look at something unusual, it's much harder than looking at something that many other scientists are also working on.
Right.
And Levengood was, in the beginning, the only bona fide scientist available, and his interest, of course, was basically the plants. And so we began looking at crop circle plants by sampling plants from inside the formations and then taking controls at various distances outside the formation in the same field, but outside. And what we were looking for were differences in the plants, which could be perhaps